A former audio programmer for CD Projekt said one of his colleagues asked during a meeting how the company thought it would be able to pull off a technically more challenging project in the same time frame as The Witcher. Someone answered, "We'll figure it out along the way." Great. That's a good answer. People who don't have to make the game. This sucks. Alright, so welcome. Today we have the sunny topic of discussion, yet again, Cyberpunk 2077's Disastrous Rollout. What? I didn't hear anything about that. Just kidding. So, if you're watching this on YouTube, I should have uploaded by now another clip from the stream of me reacting to the apology video by the head of the Cyberpunk CD Projekt studio. I might recommend watching that before you watch this, but you don't have to. Basically, I just watched the video and kind of challenged a few of the points that they made in it. The apology parts are kind of fine, but the stuff that I took issue with it is a lot of the stuff where they said, oh, we didn't see these problems, we didn't see this coming, it was unexpected, it was really hard for us to port to the old generation of consoles. And I took a lot of issue with that stuff because when you're in these studios, the developers know what's going on, and the QA team knows what's going on, and it's up to the management to listen to those people and change their plans accordingly. If they can, sometimes, I guess, higher-ups won't listen because stockholders also have opinions about when games should come out. So with that said, after watching that and kind of reacting to that and getting a feel of what is it's not like a final word, but what are they really going to say to you out there, the gamer? What do they have to say about how this is all going? A lot of people called this inevitable, that Jason Schreier would do a deep dive on the rollout of Cyberpunk 2077 because there was a lot of talk of crunch. Jason, over the years, has done incredible reporting, getting scoops from inside the studio. I believe I saw on Twitter that he said he spoke to 20 different people from inside the studio on this project and their reactions and their stories on what was going on inside the studio during development leading up to release. And from his tweets, I haven't read this full article yet. We're going to read through it and I'll be reacting to it, like here live on Twitch. It sounds like a mess. It sounds, which isn't news necessarily, but getting more specific stories and just more word on and detail on what happened leading up to this is always, it's always useful. All the other stuff that was kind of heard before the game came out was like, well, it hasn't launched yet, so we don't have the full story of everything that happened up into and including launch. So this is probably going to be the most holistic view of maybe inside the studio until an ex-dev decides to write a book on it. Maybe if that ever happens. Yeah, so also, you can't view this article unless you subscribe to Bloomberg. So what I did was I went to subscribe to Bloomberg and I thought I was just going to be able to view it on their website, but apparently I subscribed to the mobile app, which is like $2 a month instead of like $10 a month. So I subscribed to the mobile app, so I'm actually running this in BlueStacks. So I downloaded BlueStacks on my computer and now I'm reading the full article through essentially what would be their mobile app on my computer. Anyway, let's read through this thing. I think this is going to take a bit because there's a lot to go through here. But yeah, let's just go through it. Inside Cyberpunk 2077's Disastrous Rollout, developers say they knew the game wasn't ready to be released publicly. Shock. All right, let's keep going. CD Projekt SA Chief Executive Officer Marcin, I don't know how to say this game, Iwaniski, sorry about that, sir, sorry about murdering your name, made a public mea culpa this week about the Disastrous rollout. So it's just this gentleman. Public mea culpa about the rollout of the game in December. He took personal responsibility, asked fans not to blame the team. In a somber 5-minute video, addresses the company's blog post, Iwaniski acknowledged the game did not meet the quality standard we wanted to meet. I and the entire leadership team are deeply sorry for this. And that was really the best thing that I got from that video was that they're like, hey, this is all on us, apart from the other kind of stuff that I thought was like lying, about necessarily the reasons that stuff was happening. But let's move on. Don't want to get too bogged down. I already talked about that in the last video. Iwaniski's apology. Ivaniski, man, I'm just murdering this dude's name. Their apology, the second within a month, was an attempt to restore the Polish company's reputation with scores of fans and investors who had waited 8 years for the game only to discover it was riddled with bugs and performance issues when it finally released. Uproar over the botched debut caused a 30% drop in CD Projekt's share from December 10th through mid-January. I didn't know that. I didn't know it was that steep. Interviews with more than 20... Oh, wait, I do know that. We looked at that in another... when we were talking about them previously. Interviews with more than 20 current and former CD Projekt staff, most of whom requested anonymity so as not to risk their careers, depict a development process marred with unchecked ambition, poor planning, and technical shortcomings. Employees discussing the game's creation for the first time described a company that focused on marketing at the expense of development. Marketing at expensive development. A game developer story. That's what I was thinking about this game today, just a really quick sidetrack. I was thinking about Cyberpunk today and how it looks like every other big flop from a game coming out in the past 5-10 years of video games where it's all style and no substance, where they advertised it to fucking hell and everyone knew this game was coming out and the art style's so cool, the music's so cool, and they got you in this environment. You're like, oh, I'm ready to be immersed. Immerse me. And then it's just like nothing. It's just a big pile of shit that they've immersed you in. All right, so CD Projekt declined to comment on the process or provide interviews for the story. What? Shocking. The Polish company will spend the next few months working on fixes to Cyberpunk 2077 instead of planning expansions to the game or getting started on the next installment of its other popular franchise, The Witcher. The first new update will be released towards the end of January and a second in the weeks after, Iwaniski said. This wasn't how the development team envisioned starting 2021. Shock. Now, instead of celebrating a successful release, they will aim to turn Cyberpunk 2077 into a redemption story. It'll be an uphill battle, unlike competitors such as Electronic Arts and Ubisoft. SA, CD Projekt only releases one major game every 5 years, and the company's relying on Cyberpunk 2077 to be a significant hit. Yeah, this isn't like new that they've had to, like with The Witcher 3, I think they had to do some decent patching right after the launch, but the game just launched more stable. It just wasn't in nearly the place that this game was. Also, when they mention The Witcher here, when Jason mentions The Witcher here, it seems like they are going to refer to The Witcher a lot when talking about the development of this game because it was the last big game they released, obviously. And it's interesting to see kind of the top-down view from management and how they think the studio is going to get through developing a game based on prior success. Cyberpunk 2077, a role-playing game set in a sci-fi dystopia, had a lot going for it. Warsaw-based CD Projekt was already well known for an earlier blockbuster titled The Witcher 3, and Cyberpunk benefited from a massive ad blitz and a leading role from actor Keanu Reeves. Actor is what I just said. Actor Keanu Reeves. Thanks to pre-launch hype, the game sold 13 million copies at $60 apiece in the first 10 days after release. CD Projekt was, for a while, the most valuable company in Poland. For a moment in time. A beautiful moment. CD Projekt was great. Doing great. What happened? Early reviews were generally good, but once players got the game in their hands, they realized it had problems on PC, and it was almost unplayable on consoles. It performed so poorly that Sony removed the game from the PlayStation Store and offered refunds, an unprecedented move, while Microsoft slapped on a label warning customers they may experience performance issues on Xbox One until the game is updated. I think the only reason Microsoft didn't have to pull it was because they have a better refund policy than Sony does, but Sony's refund policy is so bunk and it's so not well fleshed out that it was just easier to pull it from the store and also give refunds to the people who previously bought it. CD Projekt is facing an investor lawsuit on claims that they were misled. Yeah, I read through that the other day. Basically, they're saying hey, you lied to the investors and said that the game was in a more stable place before launch, and it wasn't, and now your company looks like shit and our investment has gone into the toilet. So that's kind of the basis for the lawsuit. In his message, Iwaniski concedes that the company underestimated the task. He said that because the game city was so packed and the disk bandwidth of the old generation consoles is what it is, it constantly challenged us. While the company extensively tested before the game's release, Iwaniski said it didn't show many of the issues players experienced. Developers who worked on the game argued otherwise, saying that many common problems were discovered, the staff just didn't have time to fix them. I literally addressed this in the previous video that should be up on the YouTube by the time this one goes up. Yeah, of course they knew. That is always how it happens in game development and in software development in general. QA and the developers know about the problems and they're not taken seriously by the management, or they'll tell them it'll take me this long to fix it and they just won't listen. That's, yep, 10 out of 10. Great job, everybody. Cyberpunk 2077 was an ambitious project by any standard. CD Projekt's previous success, The Witcher, was set in a medieval fantasy world full of swords and spells, but everything in Cyberpunk was a departure from that framework. Cyberpunk was a sci-fi rather than fantasy. Instead of a third-person camera in which the player character appeared on screen, Cyberpunk used a first-person view. Making Cyberpunk would require CD Projekt to invest in new technology, new staff, new techniques it hadn't explored before. Another indication of how CD Projekt stretched things too far, was that it tried to develop the engine technology behind Cyberpunk 2077, most of which was brand new simultaneously with the game, which slowed down production. Yeah, that's challenging. I had this issue when I was in game development. Our studio picked up a new engine. It wasn't our engine, but we paid for it from another like studio, another engine studio that basically just made engines. They didn't make games. Anyway, our team lead didn't know how lighting worked in the engine, and it meant that basically halfway through the project, we had to redo all the 3D assets in a lot of ways. There was a lot of stuff for us to fix with the 3D models, and with the ways that the light mapping works on the models, which is how it's rendering the lighting when you put the 3D object into the engine, how it does the math to make it look. They didn't understand how it worked because the engine was new and we were working on the game as they were still understanding how the engine worked. So at a certain point, they just had me and a bunch of other what are they called, interns, and other contractors. We were just remaking assets. I got to make new assets for a month, and then most of my time there was remaking or fixing broken stuff because they didn't know what they were doing. My bosses didn't know what they were doing. Game development, baby! One member of the team compared the process to trying to drive a train while the tracks are being laid in front of you at the same time. It might have gone more smoothly if the track layers had a few months head start. Yeah. Probably would have been better. Adrian Jakubiak, sorry about murdering your name, a former audio programmer for CD Projekt, said one of his colleagues asked during a meeting how the company thought it would be able to pull off a technically more challenging project in the same time frame as The Witcher. Someone answered, "We'll figure it out along the way." Great. That's a good answer. People who don't have to make the game. This sucks. This is exactly the stuff that I was talking about in the last video, and that, people who have made games or in software development can tell you about all the time. That maybe a lot of fans maybe don't appreciate about game development when things come out broken, is they might know that this is going to be a big problem. The developers are like, this is going to be not good. And the management's like, you guys got it. You'll do it. And it's like, you don't understand how learning works, apparently. The first time you learn to do something, you suck at it. And so your first attempt at doing that thing, let's say it's cooking a meal, you might fuck it up, right? The first time you follow a recipe and make something, you just might fuck it up. That's a pretty easy comparison, right? The first time they're using this engine, they're learning how the engine works. They don't understand all the complexities and all the quirks or tricks with it because they're currently making it or working with it as they're building it. It's very difficult to get it the first time when you're working with new technology. Cool. Let's keep going. For years, CD Projekt had thrived on the mentality, but this time the company wasn't able to pull it off. I knew it wasn't going well, said Jakubiak, because how disastrous it would be. I just didn't know how disastrous it would be. Good. Part of the fans' disappointment is proportional to the amount of time they spent waiting for the game. Although Cyberpunk 2077 was announced in 2012, was it really? I didn't even know that. The company was still mainly focused on on its last title in full development. It didn't start until late 2016. That's when CD Projekt essentially hit the reset button, according to people familiar with the project. Sure. That's when it hit the reset button. Oh, goodness. Yeah, I mean, they were still working on the Witcher stuff and doing Witcher stuff. So I guess in 2016, they kind of were like, okay, let's like refocus and like redo some of this shit. That's not that shocking. Studio head Adam Badowski took over as director, demanding overhauls to Cyberpunk's gameplay and story. For the next year, everything was changing, including fundamentals like the gameplay perspective. Top staff who had worked on The Witcher 3 had strong opinions on how Cyberpunk should be made, which clashed with Badowski and led to the eventual departure of several top developers. Great! This is great! My god, they did it so bad. Imagine being this bad of a manager. Imagine being this fucking bad at your job. This is insane. This is also a story that's been heard many times through game developers' history. People in the studio, you learn how to do things a certain way, right? As a studio, as a company, you have a process of doing things that you kind of want to continue. Even if it's not the best, you kind of want to keep doing it because at least you know how to do it. And when new management comes in, they might have this bold new idea and they're like, we're going to do it this way. And you're like, whoa. We don't know how to, it's kind of different for us. This is going to be new. We're going to have to learn all this stuff. And, you know, leading to top developers at the company leading at the start of a big new project is not great. It's not a great way to start. Okay. Oh boy. Much of CD Projekt's focus, according to several people who worked on Cyberpunk 2077, was on impressing the outside world. A slice of gameplay was showed at E3, the industry's main trade event in 2018. It showed the main character embarking on a mission, giving players a grand tour of a seedy, crime-ridden night city. Fans and journalists were wowed by Cyberpunk 2077's ambition and scale. What they didn't know was that the demo was almost entirely fake. CD Projekt hadn't yet realized and coded underlying gameplay systems, which is why so many features such as car ambushes were missing from the final product. Developers said they felt like the demo was a waste of months that should have gone towards making the game. That's really frustrating, and I can relate to this. I've worked on stuff at my job and other places of work where basically the client is lied to. You know, we'll show them how the product will maybe work once this thing is done, but it is faked, you know, whether it be that their shortcuts were taken in programming like this little demo, you know, or whether it's literally just like a trailer that isn't like how the game actually functions with its systems. I've worked with customers recently and in the past where basically they were like, hey, isn't it supposed to work like this? I saw this in the demo of the product. And basically I had to say, yeah, that was basically like that was, you know, a fake demo. It doesn't really work that way. He basically just made it so it looks like it did this. Now we actually have to make it do this. The person who did the demo basically tricked the client that then I had to tell it doesn't work that way. So that's good. This is good. Strong start. Employees were working long hours, even though Iwaniski told staff that overtime wouldn't be more mandatory in Cyberpunk 2077. More than a dozen workers said they felt pressure to put in extra hours by their managers or coworkers anyway. There were times that when I would crunch up to 13 hours a day. Good. A little bit of that was my record probably, and I would do 5 days a week working like that. Said the former audio programmer, adding that he quit the company after getting married. I have some friends who lost their families because of these sort of shenanigans. And this is the real problem with all the stuff that we've been talking about with like the management not knowing what they're doing and stuff, is it comes down on the people who love video games and want to make video games, right? It kind of ruins their lives, right? The people making that thing that you really like are having a really bad time because the people who hold all the money and run the project are unrealistic with their expectations, and it just hurts up. It just hurts everybody. The overtime didn't make development of the game any faster. At E3 in June 2019, CD Projekt announced the game would come out on April 16th, 2020. Oh, wow. I didn't know it was pushed back that hard. April. Okay. I mean, oh, goodness. All right, fans were elated, but internally, some members of the team could only scratch their heads, wondering how they could possibly finish the game by then. One person said they thought the date was a joke. A developer thought the date was a joke. Oh my god. Based on the team's progress, they expected the game to be ready in 2022. Yeah. Developers created memes about the game getting delayed and making bets on when it would happen. Yeah, I mean, this is just sad that, like, literally the people making the game are just like, fucking good one, my boy. Like, there's no way this is going to be done by then. And I've heard stuff from people who have played the game that, like reviewers and stuff that are just like, yeah, it just seems like that there's this whole system that's just not, and they mentioned earlier, Jason mentioned earlier in this article, there's just stuff that they showed off that's like just not in the game. They just had to cut whole systems out of the game to get this out on time. So, like, not only did it come out broken and shitty, it's also just less of the vision that the people who are making the game wanted it to be. Canceling features and scaling down the size of Cyberpunk's Metropolis helped, but the team's growth hampered some departments, developers said. While The Witcher 3 was created by roughly 240 in-house staff, according to the company, Cyberpunk's credits show the game had well over 500 internal developers, but because CD Projekt wasn't accustomed to such a size, people who worked on the game said their teams often felt siloed and unorganized. At the same time, CD Projekt remained understaffed. Games like Grand Theft Auto 5 and Red Dead 2, often held up as examples of quality the company wanted to uphold, were made by dozens of offices and thousands of people. Yeah, so I don't know if people appreciate how large some of these staffs can be making some of these games that come out every year or every other year by certain studios. Just as an example, I know I have friends who work on the Assassin's Creed franchise, and it's thousands of people. It's thousands of people. It's 2,000 to 3,000 to 4,000 teams, several studios based for the Assassin's Creed, most of them based out of Montreal, where 2,000 people work, but they have multiple studios around the world, essentially almost working around the clock to get these things out when they say they're going to come out, So 500 people for a game like this to be released in this amount of time is foolish, let's say. There are also cultural barriers brought on by hiring expats from the US and Western Europe. The studio mandated everyone speak English during meetings with non-Polish speakers, but not everyone followed these rules. Oh. That's difficult. I didn't actually really I had a similar issue. I worked in Montreal during my short stint in game development, and everyone spoke English there for all of the meetings, but there was still a divide. The bulk of the studio was French speaking, and a smaller number of us were English primarily speaking people, and there's just a cultural divide, and most of the management was French speaking, and yeah, it just wasn't great. It was hard to convey information with some of them because some of them were from France. A large part of the studio actually came from France, and really English was not a strength for them, and so sometimes conveying information and challenges when working on things was difficult. So that's tough. That's not easy to deal with, especially if people just didn't follow this rule for meetings. That's wild that you could have team meetings and some people just have no idea what's going on, and they probably needed one of their teammates to translate after the fact. That's fucking insane. Even as the timeline looked increasingly unrealistic, management said delaying wasn't an option. Their goal was to release the game before the new consoles from Microsoft and Sony, expected in the fall of 2020, were even announced. That way, the company could launch the game on existing PlayStation 4 and Xbox One and PC, and then double dip by releasing versions down the road for the next generation consoles. People who bought the old console's version would receive free upgrades when the new console ones were available. Some engineers realized that Cyberpunk 2077 was too complex of a game to run well on the 7-year-old consoles. When it's a city full of bustling crowds and hulking buildings, they said management dismissed their concerns, however, citing their success pulling off The Witcher 3. This is another very good example of management not knowing what they're talking about and the developers raising concerns. Yeah, I mean, the developers realized, hey, this is, and I talked about this in the previous video, where they knew they were releasing these games for the Xbox One and the PlayStation 4, and if it would have been obvious very quickly to the development team that like this is going to be difficult to hit these marks on this generation of stuff. Maybe we should just release it on the next generation of stuff. But then they're like, oh, we released The Witcher 3 on these consoles, and it's understandable that they were trying to force them to put it out on those old consoles because that's where most of your player base is, right? You're going to get a lot of people to buy it on that old generation first because the new consoles won't really be easy to get that soon. They're probably, assuming correctly, consoles are usually hard to get for the first year after launch. So it's smart that they were like, hey, we have to release it on the last generation consoles from a sales perspective. But it was stupid of them to not heed their warning and maybe say, okay, well then if we can't do this with our scope, then we need to draw back our scope so we can make the game functional to the largest player base who's going to be buying this game. That's pretty dumb. All right, so moving on. By the end of 2019, management finally acknowledged that Cyberpunk needed to be delayed. Last January, the company pushed the release date to September. In March, the pandemic began, and everyone had to complete the game from their homes without access to their office console development kits. Most developers would play builds of their game on their home computer, so it wasn't clear to everyone how Cyberpunk might run on the PS4 and Xbox One. External tests, however, showed clear performance issues. Oh boy. I didn't even think about that. I knew the pandemic obviously would have affected it in some way, but I really didn't think about that, about how, hey, these our developer consoles like can't leave the studio. A lot of times there's rules about like from Sony and Microsoft about like what you can, like where the console can be and like who has control of it, like we signed a contract with your company, you can't bring a console home, you can't bring a development console home. That's that's not part of our agreement. They've signed deals with these companies to get these consoles so that, and like they would be breaking the trust between them and Microsoft or Sony if they did that. So that's good. Iwaniski also said that the communication issues resulting from teams working from home amid COVID-19 restrictions meant a lot of the dynamics we normally take for granted got lost over video calls or emails. The game's debut slipped again to November. As the launch date drew closer, everyone at the studio knew the game was in rough shape and needed more time, according to several people familiar with the development. Chunks of dialogue were missing, some actions didn't work properly. When management announced in October that the game had gone gold, that it was ready to be pressed to discs, there were still major bugs being discovered. The game was delayed another 3 weeks as exhausted programmers scrambled to fix as much as they could. When Cyberpunk 2077 finally launched on December 10th, the backlash was swift and furious. Players shared videos of screens overrun by tiny trees or characters gallivanting without pants, and compiled lists of features that had been promised that were not in the final product. Many of the glitches and graphical issues can be fixed, developers say, though it's not clear what it will take to regain a spot in the PlayStation Store. Winning back fans may be difficult, but there's precedent for this in the video game world. Games like No Man's Sky, a space simulator, Final Fantasy XIV, an online role-playing game, and Destiny, a multiplayer loot-based shooter, recovered from rocky launches and earned critical acclaim by gradually improving after they released, and the market seems to be hopeful. CD Projekt share rose 6%, the most in 6 weeks after Iwaniski's message. So, I think the difference between, so that's it. That's the whole article. Let's look at the Furious. Right. People were mad about the launch. Yeah, they knew that they wouldn't get everything done, and seeing the game go gold is probably like, what the fuck is going on here? There's a big difference, though, in games like No Man's Sky and Final Fantasy and Destiny. Destiny has a single-player story, and technically so does No Man's Sky, but really these games are like online experiences and like games as a service, right? These are really games as a service games where you're playing and like things change and update over time, and you're really there to have like a singular experience that doesn't necessarily depend on a strong narrative, even though there are narratives in all of these games. Cyberpunk is just a narrative game. It's not like this online experience to be shared with a bunch of other people. It's just you and a story. So if you're one of these people that played through some of the game or most of the game when it was broken as fuck, even if it gets fixed, are you really gonna go back later and play more of it? Probably, maybe not. I don't think I would. And it seems like a lot of people bought this at launch. So I would be very curious to see what the return rate is on all these fixes in terms of players returning to the game and playing it. It's not like these other online games that you're playing with with other people and your friends. So I am interested in seeing exactly how and just seeing how they kind of manage this. Boy howdy. Okay, well gosh. I mean, my overall thoughts on it, it's not any I don't want to be like I told you so, but I think a lot of people, including myself, this is like, yep, it sounds exactly like what someone who's familiar with game development and bad management could have hypothesized. Basically, management not listening to the people who actually make the game, being untruthful or not forthcoming with information to their audience and investors in the company, and basically just doing magical thinking and being like, yeah, it's gonna be great, we're gonna get there, we got the magic, we made The Witcher 3, that means we can do this. And it's like, that's not how anything works. It's especially when it's not a sequel, it's a new title, they're doing new technologies, saying, well, we did this, that means we can do this. And it's like, with The Witcher, you had a building series and you knew where you were coming from. It's the same type of thing. They went from third person to first person. They went from a large kind of sprawling world where you could spread out your assets to tightening and bringing everything in really close together. It's just a much different thing that you're doing in terms of streaming assets into the game. So yeah, it's sad, but it's not necessarily mind-blowing. I'm glad I read it and was able to take a look at it, but oh boy. Well, we'll see how this goes for them. We'll see how it goes for them and what they're able to do after this very good launch of a video game. This is funny, but I'm interested in almost the next one. If they make another one of these games, Cyberpunk 2078, 2079, whatever they want to do, I'd be interested in seeing what they do, because this development studio clearly cares about what they're doing. The developers obviously poured blood, sweat, and tears into this thing. I'd love to see a better swipe at this game with all of the grunts that they want to put behind it, and maybe some fucking, maybe some more respect for the development team from the management and some more understanding,